Hello everyone. Good now. Welcome to the Research Design Seminar Series hosted by the MIT Systems Awareness Lab. My name is Dr. Lana Cook, Associate Director at the lab, and I'm delighted to open up this new series, launching with 3 sessions this week and continuing on through 2024. We're convening communities of researchers and practitioners around the globe investigating the science of systems change. These convenings are made possible by our generous supporters, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Stewart Foundation, and Grace Charitable Foundation. And we dedicate this session in honor of the late Doreen Dowds. In this session, we connect researchers and practitioners together to explore diverse methodologies and research approaches to systems change. We'll begin today with this foundational session, which maps the wider research aims of the MIT Systems Awareness Lab and our particular approach to systems change in a presentation by our lab's founding co-director and research director, Dr. Miriam Boell. Then we'll dive deeper into one mode of inquiry, that of the lived experience, through a demonstration research interview with Lukas Herrmann, our research affiliate, and education practitioner, Trina Hagaru of the Center for Systems Awareness. We'll have some dedicated time for questions and comments and open discussion following both Mette and Lukas's presentations respectively, but always welcoming questions, comments, ideas in the chat. The spirit of this series is to build a community designing research together, and so we thank you for joining us on this journey of investigating the science of systems change. I'll hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Boell.
Good morning and good now and good present moment, everyone. Lovely to see you. Of course, I'm really enthused about having you all joining us here on Zoom. We're so used to having our Zoom calls with the global community in a different context of our community of practitioners that we work with around the world through the Center for Systems Awareness. So being able to host a overlapping group of people, but also a much more diverse group of people than whom we're currently working with in this session is a joy and really exciting. And I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. The purpose of this series is that we had originally thought we'd do another conference. Like some of you know, we hosted our kind of initial conference, Systems Awareness Conference at MIT last year. But we felt that there's a kind of a depth of the different aspects of scientific explorations that are kind of needed in the space in order for us to have more of a informed conversation with our practitioners. So this series is initiated this week, but it'll continue with what we aspire to have as monthly calls with a great diverse group of scientific colleagues in our global community of scientists who can engage directly in conversation with the many practitioners around the world, and of course, particularly in those places where we're working and studying how we can begin to describe from a scientific perspective what compassionate systems change is. So this is an invitation to not just join us today and this week, but also to stay tuned as we begin to schedule these various calls that will facilitate conversations between scientists and practitioners from this very broad field of how we can study and understand the kind of changes we would like to see in the world. So my name is Mette Miriam Boell, as Lana shared. I'm the co-director and research director, co-founder of this MIT Systems Awareness Lab. And the lab was basically, we created the lab basically because we've now had 10 years of pretty intense learning through the Center for Systems Awareness with this systems awareness methodology with compassionate systems change. It's the framework that we're using in many different places in the world to create changes in education systems. We all feel that we are ready to not just work directly in education, but more at the level of society as well, so that people who would really like to be part of shaping a different trajectory and a different future for our children and those who are yet to be born, that there is an opportunity to join into this budding global movement that is kind of coming together around a deep aspiration for compassionate systems change. So there's an open invitation for people in this space and for everybody else who like me and like many others have deep grievances about the state of the world, and particularly about the mental health and well-being of our children, and how we're not addressing that adequately, which is the reason why we're working in education. And also, seeing the connection between the inner state of humans and the experiences we have of how our global systems are deteriorating and kind of destabilizing around our very ears, like our climate, and we talk about extinction rates, and we know there's plastic everywhere, and so on and so forth. So all of these large systems issues are tied to what it means to be a human being in our understanding. And I'll try to be very concise today. I won't go into too much detail, but just really invite people into this line of thinking along with us. I'm well aware that for a lot of you who are on the call, you know the work really well. And then the other half of people who are on the call or potentially watching this recording won't know the work and you don't have a kind of a preconceived notions of what all this means. And I want to make sure that when we give a presentation like this, that it's really a broad invitation for everyone. So for some of you who are master practitioners and who've worked with compassionate systems for many years, it might be a little redundant, or, oh, I know all this stuff already. And then for some of you, it might be, more new and exploratory. So that's the aspiration for this talk. And basically, a few things I should probably say about myself before we go into the weeds of things is I am a biologist originally. I studied behavior, and I studied the animal behavior and then human behavior, and I studied the evolution of complex social systems. And I've been driven by or motivated by a deep sense of wonder my whole life, and mainly connected to a feeling of sadness, as I recall from early on, that I've always been really puzzled why human beings are doing what they're doing and why we're all showing up like we are, and that kind of perceived sense of disconnect with who we are as living systems and who we are as part of nature. And so that's been my kind of deepest motivation for exploration my whole life. So I studied behavior. I'm an ethologist. I also studied biosemiotics, so I tried to understand living processes as interactions of sign language. I studied a lot of philosophy of science and history of science and so on, philosophy of nature, to really try to kind of, in a broad perspective, come into this territory. And then part of the beauty of working in this domain of systems change, and a kind of a directional systems change, we're talking about compassionate systems change, is that there is a kind of a fundamental principle underlying understanding of systems, which is that structures shape behavior. So one of the things that I'm keenly interested in is to study the structures in place, the structures of society, the structures of our system of education, and so on, and try to understand how they can be twerked or redesigned to produce different outcomes, that the behavior that comes out of the structure in place is a different one. And in part, I am really, I have a really deep interest in this phenomenon that over the last couple of 100 years in our industrialized model of society and all the great accomplishment that has been made within this era of time. Science, the modern Western scientific mindsets were also developed during this time. And in part, it's that whole mindset is really based on in the aspiration to cut to the bone of things, to be able to be very precise and concise and rigorous about how we talk about science. There has been a tendency to become extremely reductionistic, and I don't think that it's even the least bit kind of challenging modern day or contemporary scientific traditions right now to say that reductionism has been a kind of an instrumental part about how our scientific paradigms have developed over the last couple of hundred years. And so when we think about how structure shapes behavior, we can think about that our societies, by and large, are shaped by a scientific understanding. The food we eat, the clothes we wear, how we transport ourselves, the buildings we live and breathe in, the water we drink, the way in which we operate in society has a scientific underpinning. Think about medication, for example, which is one of the things I would like to keep from the old paradigm. The ability for us to go in and say, well, I have this kind of pain, and then we can get a specific type of medication that's directly pointing to whatever the underpinnings of our condition is. So it's all kind of scientifically founded. And at the same time, when we have this kind of reductionistic mindset that's kind of at the heart of how we think about science, that means that the artifacts we create in society are also reductionistic in their very way in which we've perceived them. And the outcomes of that are, a tendency for really fast-paced linear growth, a tendency for constant optimization, efficiency, that whole lean structure, and so on and so forth. And what happens is that we shape these institutions, often, of course, with the best of intention, but they're shaped out of a mindset that comes from this reductionistic understanding of what's needed in the world. And then those institutions in return begin to shape how we think about things. So we internalize the structures that we grow up in. And what we see as an outcome of that is, as many of you will know, we talk about underlying structure as comprised of artifacts and mental models. So the mental models are the ways in which we think and feel and kind of habitually orient ourselves about things. And then the artifacts are the physical manifestations of that mental model. But then the artifacts in return becomes a way in which we're constantly, our mental models are constantly shaped. It's a dynamic reinforcing loop. And the best kind of quote that we have to describe this is actually one from Winston Churchill, where he says, first we shape the walls, and then the walls shape us. So there's that constant dynamic that once we're in an institution that was thought out many years ago in its foundational function, it consistently primes us to think about things and feel about things in a particular way, no more so than in education. And we'll come back to that momentarily. So the reason why this is important is because some of the things that we've reduced out of our structures of society are, what has been left out was seen as the unnecessary stuff. But that's all the stuff that has to do with, a focus on the quality of our relationships, how we live meaningful lives, how we can experience a sense of belonging, how we can cultivate a sense of connectedness, and all those things that actually make life worthwhile. So we find, and we are pretty certain that the inner workings of the human that has kind of been left out of the equation of modern fast-paced society by and large, when we've described how we've built our structures of society, that kind of internalized worldview that has come out of this mindset is causing a tremendous amount of suffering. the suffering of loneliness, the suffering of stress, the suffering of anxiety, of not being good enough, of feeling wrong, of not feeling a sense of belonging, lack of sense of purpose in life, and so on. We know that all of those are key for an experience of well-being in life. And when we think about how we've structured our educational systems, there's no room for failure, there's teaching to the test, there is a finite answer to infinite questions, and so on and so forth. We can see that there's a mismatch between what an enlivened human being needs in the world of sense of connection and belonging and meaning and so on, and what's provided from the structural way in which we've organized ourselves. So some of what we're looking at, and just to highlight this, to make this completely evident, this is my favorite one-liner, I'm sure many of you have heard it before. Very well-educated people, extremely well-educated people, mainly men, over the last couple of hundred years have made the decisions at the global level that has led to the outcomes we see today. And these are outcomes of, a rampant polycrisis in the world. Climate change, migration, increase in migration rates, a pandemic of loneliness, a pandemic of stress, anxiety, and depression, extinction rates, no real connection to nature and understanding that we too are part of nature. We grew out of an evolutionary process that's been around for eons, and that we're part of that whole way in which life has become self-referential on our planet over time. All of that has been caused by decisions made by really well-educated people. So the primary reason why we work in the field of education and why we see the essential part of change needs to come from this place is two things. One is, if this is the outcome of what really decisions that really well-educated people make over time, then something has to change in education. And secondly, we have deep concern and care for the declining mental health and well-being of children everywhere in our world. We cannot passively sit by and watch this rampant decline everywhere we work, and that's many, many different countries in the world. In fact, in the decade that led up to COVID, not even including COVID, but in that decade, American teenagers, the suicide ideation and suicide attempts grew by 100% within 10 years in American teenagers. We cannot just sit quietly by and pretend that this will pass on its own. We have to make decisions about how we want the trajectory for the future to look. And the one we're staring at right now is pretty dismal, and for many of us produces states of anxiety and grief. So this is part of the reason why we're really invested in this work, obviously. Now, in the old structure, the old paradigm that we've all internalized and grown up in, and we can call it by all kinds of names, that's not so important right now. But in that structure, the way to deal with something when we want something new is we cut off the old thing and push it aside and say, that's not good enough anymore, we want something new. But then we would just be reproducing the old structure. So in the paradigm that we hope to be birthing, and that we're part of birthing with many, many other people around the world, it's a paradigm of integration. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to look in a meaningful way at what are the things in the current system that we would like to keep, and how can we gradually integrate them through these processes of awareness, of compassion, of what we call enlivenment, coming back to a kind of a way of reinvigorating and revitalizing what it means to be a living human being on our planet. And it's quite lovely and wonderful to be able to work in a space like this, because obviously as people start to resonate and do more of this work, it becomes very caring and nourishing spaces that we operate in. So one of the ways in which we do that we'll illustrate a little later with Lukas and Trina, who they'll demonstrate one of the approaches that we have for these initial explorations. But I want to just share with you how we're approaching this whole thing, and how we talk about the ecosystems of education as something that is, really probably one of the most rigid structures in society, and also one of the most important ones. So this is what we talk about when we say we're trying to take steps towards a science of systems change. And in this understanding of ecosystem of education, I'll be pretty brief with this, and many of you who were with us last year and so on will have seen this before, or many of these slides before. So I'll make it brief. It's not, the mapping itself is not so important. It's more the kind of way in which we're trying to address some of the issues that can't be teased out in a kind of a classical mapping of the ecosystem. So in this, we have, we have society and the families, they comprise of parents and children, and these are all in kind of dynamic feedback loops. They are, in a constant exchange in relation to each other. And then, some of the parents are part of families, and they're teachers, and the children become students, and their classrooms where all of this is rolling out. And the classrooms are in schools usually, and then we have schools that are part of districts, and there's expanded learning or out of school experiences as well. In California, where we work a great deal, and in some other countries, we have regions or counties or something like that, that is a kind of yet another layer of the system that oversees the districts, and sometimes oversees the schools directly as well. And then, of course, we have state and province and country wide kind of agencies as well that are directly involved in multiple layers of this ecosystem. And then, of course, in the US in particular, but many other places in the world, philanthropy plays a kind of a central role in how we can address these different layers of the system. So we look at this would be a kind of a classical way of mapping the ecosystem of education. And we can already see that there's a lot of complexity in that. But our the usual way, the contemporary way in which we would look at this, we would look at the external structures and educate ourselves and learn as much as we can about all these different interdependencies and external structures that we can see in this little map here. However, what we forget to take into account is that when we are talking about an ecosystem of education, it is in its very nature intergenerational. What does that mean? It means that everybody has gone to school. It means that parents have went to school and they have a preconceived notion, they have mental models about what education should be. It's not supposed to be fun, you're not supposed to this and that, you have to learn science and math and writing and reading and so on. And that in and of itself creates a certain rigidity when we're trying to change the system. And I know that I'm talking to a lot of educators right now, and I'm sure everybody has had the experience of, trying to create a new program or a new way of doing something in school, and there's a pushback from parents because that's not what education is supposed to be, and that's not what school was like when I went to school. So it's intergenerational in that way, that it's passed on through generations what it's supposed to be like. This is a great example of how the artifacts of our institutions and how we've manifested school and the system of education in the external world is consistently shaping how we think about school in society. And then the next level here is, of course, that it's what we can call emotionally nested. And what does that mean? Well, it means that for each and every individual that's even tangentially involved in this system, there's an emotional dynamic. Think about a classroom. Everybody in the classroom has a distinct emotional orientation towards each and every one of the individuals in that classroom. The teachers will have, different emotional experiences with the different students. The students will certainly have different kind of ways in which they emotionally relate to each other in the classroom and so on. And there's no way we can capture this. There's no way in which we know how we can kind of capture this or in a meaningful way begin to take that into account when we're studying these kind of external structures. And then the next layer, of course, or the next element of complexity is that there are layers of meaning. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we consistently hold assumptions and inferences about what's going on. And it's all based on how I grew up, my cultural experiences, my personal experiences, if I have trauma, if I have had negative experiences in schools before, and so on and so forth. If I feel that it's easy for me to feel rejected and I don't like being in the classroom because I constantly feel like I'm becoming the out group and so on, that meaning exists in the context of education as well, at all levels. This is not just kids. it stays with us for our whole lives unless we intentionally do something to work with it, which is probably one of the reasons why there's so much emotional toxicity in the different kind of hierarchical layers of education. So all of a sudden we have something that looks more like this, with layers of complexity of the whole kind of inner aspect of what it means to be a human being that really can't be captured in the mapping of what an ecosystem of education is. Yet it's instrumental in how the experience of this ecosystem is, how it's and how people are in relation to each other within the context of education. So what we're trying to do with this is, of course, to point to, well, there is something that is living systems change. And living systems change takes it seriously that we, the humans, are living beings. And that means that we can't have a kind of a mechanistic or a rigid understanding of change processes only based on the external artifacts of society. But we have to take into account also that if systems actually are to change, it has to be internalized in the humans who live and breathe in the systems. It has to come as an intrinsic motivation, and it has to come with intentionality. Otherwise, no real change is going to happen. And this is probably, at least in my opinion, this is probably why most systems change efforts we've seen around this country, in the US, but all around the world, they fail to become regenerative over time. They do not produce lasting outcomes of change. There'll be peaks of elements that are changing a little bit, but then it tends to regress back to how it was, or a next level of how it used to be. So this whole understanding of living systems change, well, how are we approaching that? Because obviously we can't begin to measure all of this complexity and all of these different layers of intergenerational, emotionally nested and layers of meaning in the context. It's just that would, even the attempt to do that would make us fall right back into a super reductionistic way of orienting ourselves. So when we're trying to study the context, we somehow have to take into account that it's the living people, the living systems in the context that we're really trying to engage with. And somehow there has to be an element of awareness that is cultivated in that process. And this is why we talk about systems awareness. And let me just give you a brief overview of how we usually go about this. Some of you will recognize that this is the basic model we have for social fields. So I'll be pretty brief, but basically it says that we humans are social. We're one of the most social species on this planet, and we're social and relational way before we're individual. We can see that in how this exchange with infants as we are holding them in our arms, and the kind of mimicking of facial expressions and so on. That's literally how our brains are shaped. Our brains are shaped relationally and socially before there's any notion of being an individual. This means that when I show up in spaces, I influence other people. And when other people show up in spaces that I'm in, I'm influenced by them. Pretty much all of us have some kind of intuition about this being true. Think about when you walk into a space and there's somebody who is really grieving and sad and crying, or there's somebody who's like super angry and shouting and yelling, and we immediately have a kind of a response to that, an emotional response to that. This is because we are consistently impacted by and influenced by all the people around us, and in return, we actually also impact and influence them. And this is through our emotions. Our emotional system is a biophysical phenomenon, it's by and large not available to us in a conscious way, but its emotional systems have evolved so that we have a very fast way to be responsive to a complex environment. For example, when we're facing danger right in front of us, I'm out hiking and there's a bear and I'm afraid of the bear. It's immediate emotional responses that I will try to somehow either get away from the bear, or if I have paid attention, I'll know that running is a bad idea, so I should probably try another thing. But that's an emotional response that arises immediately. The thing is that when we have emotional responses, they leak out of us if we don't attend to them, and they impact the spaces we're in. Good news is, however, and that's why we're cultivating self-awareness and self-regulation and emotional literacy and so on, that we can lower the threshold where we can have an awareness of what's going on in our systems. That's the self-awareness 101 and emotional literacy 101. When we become aware of what's going on in our systems, we feel it. So emotion plus an awareness of the emotion equals feelings. When that happens, we can begin to have intentional choices about how we want to show up with it. So please don't hear me wrong. This is not about bashing emotions and that they're a bad thing. Not at all. They evolve for a reason and they all serve us. However, if we don't know what we're feeling, it's very hard for us to not just be reactively, habitually operating in spaces. Once we have an awareness of what we're feeling, we can gradually begin to make choices about how would I like to show up with my anger, or how would I like to show up with my fear, and not just being in that reactive habitual mode. Now, this is what we term, and in return, our whole understanding of systems is, well, individuals in relation with other individuals in these relational fields or social fields is what creates, the classrooms and the teams and our organizations and our schools and our families and society. So it's a continuum of systems that we're looking at. It's not like individualized systems and relational systems and global systems or societal systems that they're kind of discrete units. It's really a continuum where we can zoom in and out, that we, the humans, are producing the very outcomes in the world that we're looking at today, whether we want to or not. And this is what can become a generative social field. A generative social field is a field where we have an intention of really shaping the surroundings that we live in so that they become nourishing and that human beings can grow and thrive and flourish in them. And this is what we believe should be at the heart of education. This whole understanding of generative social field is just to kind of model again that the individuals is in constant exchange with the relational spaces that they're in, which is in return is shaping all the structures in society and in our world. So there is that kind of interconnectedness, profound interconnectedness by who we are, with who we are and who we are in relation to each other and how we are in relationship to our planet. And that's kind of at the essence of this work that we're doing. So how do we do that? And I'll just be very brief about this so I can make sure that there's enough time for questions and so on. But the whole notion of systems awareness is that there are different faculties of awareness, different portals into us, allowing ourselves to slow down, pay attention, notice what's going on from my body, notice what happens when I weave some awareness into my breathing. I can take a little pause or a break. Notice what happens when I'm in relation to other people, how I'm feeling. Notice what happens when I have an aspirational stance. I live with a sense of purpose and meaning in life and so on. And that all together, all those faculties together is kind of producing this more emergent or spacious property of systems awareness. And that's really what we're getting at when we're trying to study those intangible layers of the context of education in this ecosystem. We have to somehow be able to address this awareness that sits within each and every individual in the system. But how to access that is a big and challenging endeavor. So part of what we could say is that we're really trying to cultivate clarity and kindness. Clarity so that we become more clear and distinct about here's what's going on in my inner system, and that I have an intentional stance of care and kindness and compassion. That's really the dynamics that we're operating within. And basically in this site development that we're studying now for studying generative social fields and how we can be more intentionally shaping those in education. These are all the layers of education that we're involved with. So there's students and teachers and classrooms and schools and expanded learning and districts and counties and statewide agencies involved in these processes. So we have access to many different layers of the system of education with this orientation for cultivating greater awareness and gaining understanding of what it is that provides kind of the roadmap, if you will, for these change processes for the individuals, the living systems within these rigid structures of society. And those are the human beings that we're working with. So part of what we'll do now, we'll just give a little demonstration of this particular approach of microphenomenology. That's what Lukas will do a little later. I want to say just a couple of words about that. There's a French professor, Claire Petit-Manchang, who actually visited us here at MIT before, and many of us were fortunate enough to go through a training in this notion of microphenomenology. And the reason why we did that was because we really tried to prototype how can we study and describe generative social fields so that those become not just the vehicle for compassionate systems change, but also how we how we can shape, restructure education. So at the heart of it, what we really aspire to see is more generative social fields for our kids to grow up in. And now, given that social fields respond to how people operate, that means that we need to talk to the teachers, and they have to get some type of training and understanding and so on. And we need to deal with the classrooms and the schools and the principals and the district level leadership and the county level leadership and so on, so that in effect, the whole of the system begins to resonate or vibrate or have a different frequency of mode of operating, if you will. In order for us to find out what really works for people, we have to tease out some of the lived experiences of people in the systems. And that's where we're using this microphenomenological approach. Claire Petit-Manchang was a student of Francisco Varela, who was part of founding the Mind and Life Institute with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and who was anchored and coined the whole tradition of neurophenomenology, which basically is the science of experience. So we're leaning heavily on that. Now, Francisco Varela had a multi-year partnership with Humberto Maturana, the great Chilean biologist who passed a couple of years ago. They had a long partnership. Humberto Maturana created or developed the Santiago theory of cognition here at MIT. So there is a lineage of people that we're really inspired by in beginning to understand facets of this work. So this is really seen as a synthesis more than anything in how we can approach this, this understanding of change that we're so longing to see in the world. And so basically what this becomes is, because we have a kind of our approach to systems change is a kind of has a teleological aspect, which basically means that for the sake of which we are looking for this change or have the aspiration for this change, and that is compassion. Compassion sits at the heart of it. What we would like to see as outcomes coming out of all these different ways in which we're working in the world with these thousands and thousands of people who are part of really growing this change in a different way, is that we would like to have more compassionate societies. We would like for people to show up with care and kindness and respect. And we actually believe that that would be a self-reinforcing process of a very generative and prosperous future. So that's what we're here to do. So that was basically very brief. I hope it wasn't too, too much of a ramble to follow. And we have a little time now for questions. And if there are any kind of reflections you'd like to share or anything like that, we'd be happy to take those. Okay, so what can we have questions in the chat? Lana says we can have questions in the chat. We have a question in the chat. Oh, in the society include expectations. I'm not sure Rick, could you unmute and please ask me the question? I'm not sure I understand what it says here.
Good morning, and thank you for a very informative set of remarks and a fascinating concept. When I was looking at the ecosystem of education model you were describing, by the way, I particularly liked the last layer. That was very informative. But it struck me that there seemed to be, in my initial observation, a feedback loop missing regarding the expectations of employers, marketplaces, places where skills, knowledge, and experience can be transformed into earning an income, et cetera. And I'm alluding here to the economic concept of the human capital, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I understand, where education is seen as an investment intended to help the person generate a return through their career, job, et cetera. So looking at the model that you described, I just wondered, it seems to me there's very powerful influences from jobs, careers, marketplaces, et cetera, that affect education. And are they being considered in that model? And if they're not, maybe there's a reason, or should they be considered? Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Great. Thank you for clarifying. I totally understand your question now. I really appreciate it. It's a great question. And I think there are a lot of feedback loops and a lot of more complex dynamics that are not included in this mapping. So from my perspective, I had a hard time for a long time, right? I'm talking about structures in society, but what I'm really trained to do is understanding living systems, right? And so my philosophy in all of this is I can point to if the structures in place are producing the outcomes that we see in the world at current. For example, the structure of our financial system on the globe, if that's consistently producing greater wealth inequity and producing a lot of other outcomes of suffering, then something probably needs to change in that system of economics. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure, and this is where I can't swear because we're on a public setting, but I would like to underscore it with a swear word so you can imagine one yourself. But I feel absolutely certain that if kids are brought up in a framework where there's a consistent understanding of relational awareness, a consistent understanding of how I live a meaningful and purposeful life with compassion at heart, then the types of structures of economics that would come out of their thinking would be profoundly different. And that's basically the core aspiration I hold for engaging in this work. So what I'm trying to get at, Rick, and I really appreciate your question, and I'm sure that there are multiple layers that we could add on to it. All the stuff that has to do with culture, to me, is kind of a second order phenomenon, because all I really do is I relate to human beings as living systems and how we're kind of malnourished in the structures that we've created for ourselves. We've produced dead and rigid structures of society that kills us off slowly, where we can't live and we can't breathe and we can't pay attention and we can't even experience or get a sense of that we're alive by and large. It's a luxury when we're able to do that in life. So that's why those additional layers of all of the added complexities of society are not in the model at all. I hope that's helpful.
We have another question from Gareth Manning.
Yeah. Another question, can we just unmute and ask the questions? It'll make it a lot easier for me since I'm a relational being.
Hi, I'm Gareth. I'll just read what I wrote actually, because I was paying attention to what you said and it went out of my head. I'm loving this, by the way. You're brilliant and I love you. You're great. So I wrote the classic agent structure problems often characterized by the structure shaping the agent more than the agent shaping the structure. I love this approach, but I also wonder about the extent to which structural change within institutions is necessary to create the conditions for greater self-reflection, self-awareness, compassion, action practice, self-determined learning, and so on and so on. And what I'm asking specifically is, are you suggesting in the model that you are putting forth that we can change the structure from within without also changing the walls that shape us? Or are you saying that we need to do both?
That's a great question. Thank you, Garrett, and thank you for, I like you a lot. I like what you're saying. So no, it's a great question. The tendency, of course, as we've seen it in the world playing out, is that we try to change the external structures, right? In education, and specifically, we try to change the curriculum or the policy or the how we've organized it or structured it or the infrastructure or the metrics or something like that. And then we're somehow expecting that that produces change. But it doesn't, because how people relate to all these changes come out of the same habitual way in which we've always thought about things, and then no change can occur. So there is a primacy for us to work with the inner states and this awareness piece with humans, because we're somehow, it's out of balance as it is right now. That said, once we start thinking differently and operating differently and relating differently and becoming more aware of what we really want to see, this intrinsic motivation and intentional stance of compassion, we have to begin to shape the artifacts accordingly. Because if we're keeping the artifacts, say, for example, of segregation in this country, we fail to produce the kinds of outcomes that we would like to see, and then it wouldn't become a structural change. So I think both are needed. We just have a huge imbalance as it is right now, with a super attentive focus on all the external factors, all the artifacts, and very, very little attention to what it takes to change the mental models and the states of being for people in the systems. So we do both, but with a primacy of consistently cultivating awareness in all of these processes.
I get it. I love it. Let's do it. I want to learn. Thank you.
Great, thank you. You're in now. That's it.
One last question from
Okay, we have
Mark.
one more question. Mark?
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'll also read my question out that I put in the chat. Is compassion the single dimension we can optimize for and gain systems health? Or is it possible that it is ironically also reductionist and therefore with blind spots?
That's a tricky question, and I could probably geek out on this one a lot, but I can share from the perspective with which we're working with it. Compassion is a very interesting phenomenon. So in many settings, it's interchanged as with empathy. So people talk about empathy and compassion as if it's the same thing. So I just want to make sure that we have those distinctions clear. Empathy is an evolutionary strategy for complex social species to be able to figure out what's going on with the others in the pack, particularly when we don't have language. But even us who have language, if we didn't have empathy, we would be totally lost, because usually people are saying a lot of stuff that's not really what's going on inside of them. So just to make that clear. Compassion, on the other hand, is what can grow out of empathy. This beautiful phrasing is from Antonio Damasio. If you want to see the kind of layers of how, in his strange order of things, how we go from singular cells to societies, it's a brilliant layout of that. Compassion can grow out of empathy, but it has intentionality. It has a distinct intention of how I want to be in the world and how I want to relate in the world. Now, there is a tendency in many spaces that compassion is seen as some kind of soft skill, or wishy-washy, or we're always nice, or something like that. And I'm just saying that I would fail dramatically if that was the case. Compassion is really hard in many ways. It's not hard, but it's a really intense skill to cultivate, because it means that I intentionally want to care about people, even if I don't like them, even when I think they're complete idiots. I still want to care. I still want to wish them well-being. That's something that really requires cultivation. However, if we truly are to operate at the systems level, the systems will inevitably always hold people and processes that we don't like and we don't care for. When people fall into activism or other siloed ways of trying to save the world in various ways, it lacks that spacious understanding of holding the system as a whole. The only way I can do that is through cultivating compassion, because in compassion, I can hold the paradox of really thinking that people are behaving wrongly or as idiots, or they're producing negative outcomes of their behaviors, but I can still wish well-being and care for them. And that's basically the stance we're trying to cultivate. So I hope that was helpful.
Indeed, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. All right, so we'll transition now. I've primed you, Lukas, with the microphenomenology, and we'll do a little kind of take on one of the interview processes that is our initial way of gauging some of this in the systems that we work in. Lukas has done a PhD where he's explored these types of changes, perceived changes, in a really exciting project in Berlin, in Germany, Empathie macht Schule, which basically means that empathy is the root of schools. And Lukas is working with us now here at the Systems Awareness Lab at MIT to create some of these same spaces and extract some of that insight from people in the systems in a similar manner. So, Lukas?
Thank you, Mette. Thank you so much. And this, just one word, it has been really fascinating to listen to your questions and your discussion so far. So I'm glad that I can chime in here with my perspective. So actually, before doing my PhD on generative social fields, I was working in the lab with the neuroscientist Tanya Singer, who coined this distinction between compassion and empathy. And just one thing to add, which I think is super important, is that empathy can lead to empathic distress, which can then later lead to very not so social behaviors. So while compassion it maintains a sort of intentionality, as Mette said, and in the work that we did in Empathie macht Schule, it also had to do with you don't get sucked into the pain of the other, but you remain as well aware of yourself. So this is really something where it's I think valuable to draw a clear distinction, and I will later provide an example of that from my research. So I've always been really curious about this entanglement, and Gabor Mate is brilliant on this. That's true. This entanglement between inner and outer change. It's just, as Mette was describing, the bigger picture of where we are at right now on this planet and what needs to change. And somehow I think it's not possible to take ourselves and our inner states out of the equation. So how can we study that? So how can we study this inner state? How can we study experience? We're not the first ones to ask that question. It has been around for millennia, I think. The contemplative traditions, they really studied that with big rigor. But when it comes to science, at some point, science even started to define itself in opposition to this inner experience. Why? Because it's messy. Think about it, like we experience all day. You can't help but experience something. But we are not really good at paying attention to our experience. So I want to share a quote here. The faculty, this is by William James, who's one of the founding figures of psychology, who said that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. So we are really bad at paying attention to our experience, generally speaking, unless we have some sort of cultivation practice. And that makes it hard to study inner experience because it is so fleeting, it is so elusive. But this is and this is not just a scientific problem, it is also a health problem, because we know that our wandering minds are related to being unhappy, actually. And this is, of course, like with smartphones and all the distraction economy that we have. This has grown worse and worse. And the good news is that there are tools that can help us to nevertheless study our experience with some precision, not just, not stay on a surface level of, I did this and that, or yeah, that was great. Like, how are you feeling? I'm good. So what kind of good? How do you experience good? What is it really like? So there is a way to study our experience without being like a 20,000 hours shamatha meditation practitioner. And this is actually by talking about it. So it's been a great pleasure to learn about microphenomenology. And actually the instant I learned about it was the instant that I met Trina Haigaru. So we joined that same course at the lab of Richard Davidson, and Otto Scharmer was there, and Mette was there. So it was quite a round of luminaries in a small room at the Center for Healthy Minds in Madison, Wisconsin. And we learned how to dive deeper and support each other to investigate our own experience and become more intimate with what it really feels like to taste something, for example. And it's an enlivening, it can be an enlivening process to do that. And yeah, so I used this method in my PhD to investigate social field shifts in this project, Empathie macht Schule. And I want to share just one example of what can be the outcome if you use that model. And it led to something that can be look like this. I'm just going to tell you what this little graph means in the end. So I was interviewing a teacher, and she was telling me about a situation in her classroom with a student that was disruptive. It was kind of disturbing the lesson, and she already, like before entering the classroom, she felt the tension build in her body. And then he was doing his thing, chatting around, not really paying attention. So, and she felt the tension rise in her body till that point when it erupted and was like, stop it now. Right? And this is an everyday life situation for teachers. And it's exactly what makes teaching a stressful occupation. It's those conflicts, those kind of ongoing nagging conflicts with students. So when we talked about it, and she experienced a shift by participating in this project, and she had an aha moment about how she relates to that student, and it resulted in a completely different interaction. But when we investigated the initial state, and this is this left cycle here, kind of alludes to the model of social fields that Mette was speaking about. So her disciplining got coupled with his resisting. So it's kind of a pattern of interaction that they enacted together in this social field. And this teacher described it as it felt rigid. It felt like the relationship felt like a rigid bond where both are pulling in different directions and no one is really happy with it. And she also said when we investigated this experience a little further, she discovered that she felt actually she took it personal because this student wasn't behaving according to her rules. And then she could explain that to me. And that actually means that I have failed as an educator because it is my task as an educator to change the boy's behavior. And her mode of perception of the boy, she perceived him as a disturbance and also as an attack to her worth as an educator. And I mean, we have to really appreciate this. This is the emotional layer, the emotional nestedness of the situation. And this is how she showed up, with feeling attacked. And this is not at all to blame. This is very natural because she was socialized in a way to perceive of her own professional role in that way. But through the training, she got a different perspective on her role, which wasn't to change the student's behavior. Her role was to relate to the student. And that was for her a big aha, and she said a big relief. So that relief actually had an immediate outcome in the classroom, which was when the student did his thing, she wasn't as stressed because it didn't feel like an attack. And what is more, she could just inform him. She just could let him know, actually, now soon it's going to be too much. Now we're moving to this right cycle here. She could express her own boundary. And there's a lot of talk about boundaries, like setting boundaries to just children. You have to set clear boundaries or we lose all the boundaries. Actually, what is really, really impressive for children is when you show your boundary. And that's what she did. So she expressed, no, I can't work like this. Soon it's going to be too much for me. And then you have to be quiet. And she let him know that. And she could also see he's actually trying to be still. It's just he has a hard time. doing that. So she could adapt her expectations, and it created a completely different loop between them. Not that everything was fine. She said, like, this boy kept disturbing the lesson, but they had a better relationship that wasn't as stressful. So that's a real life field shift, and it doesn't transform everything, but it's a small example of how the emotional climate can become a bit more contained, less irritated, and more friendly towards each other. So that has been my example. And now I would like to invite Trina to do an interview with me, and I would like to interview Trina. She has been a principal and worked internationally on several continents. She was a principal at the Indiana International School and kind of introduced the compassionate system. So it was the first compassionate system school, and Trina, you have been in the work for a long time. And it's been a great pleasure over the years. I counted, it's been 6 years now, almost 6 years since we first met. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And so we'll demonstrate this interview process for some. Of course, we can't do a full interview right now because so this is the disclaimer. It's inspired by the microphenomenological method, but we won't do a full-blown interview because that would mean you have a 2-minute or 1-minute experience and you take 1 hour just to zoom in with great precision. So we take it a bit more lightly, but the general approach is the one that microphenomenology.
And another disclaimer is that I've known this interview was coming, so I've tried really hard not to think about it beforehand. But of course, that's impossible. So
yes, I could imagine. You probably thought about moments. So Trina is also part of the site development team, and she joined the Center for Systems Awareness. But now I would really like to ask you about an experience of a generative social field in your school. So could you, is there a moment when you were working as principal in your school where you felt something shifted when you introduced the compassionate systems framework, maybe about in that time of your career, something that stood out for you that you remember?
and the question's a little different, so that's good. It making me think. I think I would choose a staff meeting that was probably about 4 years after we had been using compassionate systems. It was a very difficult day for me. I had to suspend 2 boys. There was a fight, you know, lots of emotions running high. I was late for the meeting because, of course, I had to talk with parents after school. And so I walked into the cafeteria where the teachers and I always met, and I was 10 minutes late. And so I felt very frustrated and in a rush. And when I walked in, they had automatically just put themselves into a circle and had started a check-in.
Okay. So you were in a rush. Let me try and summarize what I heard, and I had to look at the time, so I couldn't find all the details of what you were sharing. So please help me out. So you were walking down the hallway. Is that right?
Walking through a lobby, kind of an open space. Mm-hmm.
So you were walking through a lobby, and you were kind of in a hurry. And you were encountering the teachers there, and they had already formed a circle and started a check-in.
Right.
Anything else about the setting that seems important?
It's a really large space, but they were in a fairly confined area of the room. It was very bright. The room is full of windows, so there was lots of sunshine. Yeah.
So there was sunshine. It was a large room, but they were in this confined area. And so when you walk in there, is there anything else you're seeing? So you see them sitting there. There's the bright sunlight coming in, and just just take time to go back to that moment when you walked into that through that lobby. You saw them sitting, sunlight coming.
Yeah, I can see, so I can see some peripheral things that are still happening. There are cars still picking up students from after school, and those are coming by, and I can see that through the window. And then there are students on the other side of the cafeteria in the after school program in the gym, and I can see them running back and forth through those windows.
So there's cars coming forth and there's students running back and forth that you can kind of see in the periphery through the windows. So while you see that and you see the bright sunlight coming in, is there anything else in your visual field that you notice?
I can see the circle is made up of some benches, some chairs. There are people that are grouped together in the circle by which language track they teach. I can see. Go ahead.
No. So it's benches and chairs, and it's arranged by the language tracks. So, yeah. And when you enter there, is there anything you're hearing? So while you see the cars and the students and the benches and chairs, and you see the people sitting there, is there anything that you're hearing? Sounds.
I can hear the teacher who was checking in, but I don't remember what she was saying, but I could hear her voice. I could hear faint noises, from all of the extra activities, but I could hear sometimes the movement of the benches and the chairs on the linoleum floor, like a kind of scraping sound. Yeah.
So there's this scraping sound there, and you hear the voice of the teacher who's sharing. And there's the sunlight coming in, and the benches and the chairs, and the noise of that. And are there any physical sensations, anything you feel in your body that?
I felt like my heart was beating fast when I entered, and I felt warm, and when the sun hit me, then I was just annoyed because it was hot. And I felt rushed, which made I think my breathing was a little heavier because I had been rushing.
So you felt rushed. There was heat. It was kind of annoyed from the sun, and your heart was beating faster. So we're aware of that. And
Yes.
yes. And is there anything like after you experience that, like how does it continue? Do you notice what happened next?
So I can feel the heat and I'm annoyed by it. And I think that's when I tuned into, well, that's when I saw that they were in a circle and I could see them in this circle, which I think normally I would have to orchestrate, right, to get them into that configuration. And I can hear. Oh, it was the English teacher who was a big proponent of the compassionate systems and did a lot of work. I forgot that was her. So she must have started it because it hadn't gone around the circle very long. So she was speaking, and it was interesting because I was just able to let go. Like,
Okay. So there was a moment, so you noticed it was the English teacher was speaking, and there was this moment when you noticed what they were actually doing. So you noticed, oh, they are doing a circle, they're doing a check-in, and there was this, you can actually let go. And when you let go, what is that like? What was that like? Is it physical? Is it?
yes, my heart began to slow down. I noticed my breathing deepening. I stood still for a moment.
So you stood still and your breathing was deepening.
Mm-hmm.
You also said it was something that usually you would orchestrate,
Mm-hmm.
and now it was kind of happening on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I see a smile coming up when you think of that.
Yeah, I remember just that deep feeling of satisfaction of after, moving in with one set of emotions and physical responses, and then it's so quickly moving to something else.
Mhm.
It was a
So,
really huge shift in a very short amount of time.
all right. So you shifted from being hurried, being kind of annoyed by the sun, suddenly to that release or letting go and a sense of satisfaction. So I'm curious about, does the satisfaction have a location in your body?
So I scanned the room to see if there was a place for me to join the circle. And I remember when I sat down that it was just like I felt like my muscles kind of released, my shoulders dropped. I put all my things down, and I don't know, but I feel like I probably just went, um,
So, so you feel the shoulders coming down, so the this,
yeah.
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 And I would like to ask you now, like, so you sit down in the circle, and in that moment, if you kind of take a step back and feel like, what is your sense of the field in that moment? And really take your time just to let it arise. So there was the satisfaction you spoke about, this release, this shoulders.
It was this sense of normalcy,
Mhm.
community.
So something is normal about it. How do you notice that it's normal when you say it's normal? What feels normal about
So there's not that feeling of, there's not that feeling that I've imposed this,
it? Mhm.
I've created this at this moment, but there's a feeling of this is our culture now.
Mm.
And kind of, I think some of the release was not just about the day and hurry, but was that we're doing it.
We're doing it.
we're
a
doing
sense of
it.
we're doing it. It's not just on you,
Uh-huh.
but it's a we're doing it. It's a community. It's normal in the community now.
Right.
Becoming our culture.
Yeah.
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 Thank you, Trina. I would love to dive more deeply into all of that, but for now, thank you very much for sharing that moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And it
And
wasn't even one of the scenarios I was thinking. So
yeah, so it was fresh. We weren't. I mean, it's important to say. So we weren't making that up, right? This wasn't prepared in a way. So Trina just really went to that moment. I think it's really good to know telling that.
mhm.
Yeah.
There's something about this interview process that is so, because someone's affirming and reminding you of what you said and what you've seen and what you feel and what you hear, that allows you to uncover more.
Mm. Yeah.
Because you're holding that, the interviewer's holding that for the interview.
And that's in the idea of microphenomenology. That's actually a validation that you discover more means that you're actually going into the memory and into the experience more deeply, because you discovered, oh, it was the English teacher. And that's kind of how our memories are organized, is in this associative way. So suddenly something else gets activated that wasn't present before, that wasn't conscious before.
Mhm.
So we enter more deeply into it. And another thing I would like in the end to say is that the interview situation is also a social field. And witnessing this interview situation with you all is also a social field. And what can happen is that those resonances and so on, they also travel now through us. Like I was feeling what you were feeling, parts of it, or it was kind of mirrored in my system. And I could imagine that the same was happening also for some of those who were watching it, that you have a natural resonance, or maybe an absence of a resonance, but there's some form that this is informing the field right now. All right. Thank you, Trina.
Thank you, Lucas.
And
It's always a pleasure.
yes. So from here, I'd say we open it up to questions, comments.
It was lovely, Lucas and Trina, and just want to underscore, I think that might be clear, but I just want to underscore that this is one of the processes through which we begin to tease out the kind of deeper layers of what the experience of being in the fields are, of what the experience of living in the context of education is, so that we can begin to study more cohesively how we can create a structure that consistently produces outcomes where people feel that they're alive and there's space for them and they're cared for and they can thrive and flourish and grow. So this is one of the kind of entryways into learning about, the experiences of people in the system. And at the same time, it's one of the ways in which we cultivate our own awareness, because it comes in, all information comes in through a multitude of senses in our systems, but we have a very small channel usually where we reproduce these experiences. We think about it and then we have a kind of an answer. But when we can dive into it like this and these layers of experience, it becomes a much richer way in which we can orient ourselves in the present moment. Gareth?
Gareth is raising your hand. Yeah.
I don't want to like hog the time. I'm just like very interested in all this. It really calmed me down, which is fascinating. I'm wondering about particular applications of this kind of approach. I actually had a student who taught me this years ago, and she brought it up in her personal project on, I don't even remember what it was, but she did, I think, around meditation or something like that. And I totally forgot that it existed. And where my mind was going, as I was in a conversation recently with a professor at Stanford named Heather Mellon, who's an expert on teaching for purpose. And I'm wondering whether like this might be actually quite applicable to that kind of interview protocol, which is aimed at helping students set and think about sort of short-term and long-term goals, especially goals beyond the self. Do you think that that would work? I'm guessing it would. And more to sort of like the thrust of my question, what kind of things can this help us understand, and what are the constraints? Like, what can it not help us understand?
Great question. So just one reply on what it can, and it's been really interesting that it could actually be applied. It has been applied to in schools, for example, with students learning math, because you actually can explicate the strategies that they use when calculating. And there's been funny things like they found out, like one student, she was seeing the numbers on the blackboard, but the blackboard was very small in her inner vision. So they asked her to make the blackboard bigger, and then it was easier for her to calculate. I mean, honestly, these are reported cases. So you can actually improve also on that level, and it's very applicable to also aspirational questions, as you were sharing. So you can very much use it for that. I would say it's been also used in medical context. Like, there's a big stream of microphenomenology in meditation research. Like, what is the experiential footprint of particular meditation styles? That's also been done in the lab with Tanya Singer, for example. Like, where is the awareness in the body? What are difficult, like particular sensations, and so on? These are things you can study, and it's been also used in medical context, where patients were able to, like epileptic patients were able to identify the aura before the seizure, and that enabled interventions. So it's a powerful tool when we get to access the deeper layers of our experience. It can be used in different contexts.
Super cool. Thank you.
Yeah. The limitations, you asked about.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Of course, I mean, this is what we get at is deeper and deeper accounts of what people experience. This is what it does, and it does nothing else in a way. So that we still have to make sense of those accounts. We have to interpret them. We have to, and this is all subject to the limitations that research is subject to. So it's not a method that can do anything, but it's an interesting one because it is also a very powerful intervention. So that you can use it in coaching.
My intuition is that, like, so we often have self-delusional narratives that kind of like shape our experience, and like we're angry or whatever, and we tell ourselves these stories that keep us kind of locked in or whatever. And it seems like this kind of approach in like activating sort of the sensorial experience first might actually disrupt that.
Yes.
Is that like a research area?
Yes, I mean, I think it would inevitably lead to a greater clarity about the different aspects of what you are experiencing, and thereby enable you to disentangle them. So you can disentangle the story from the sensations by paying close attention to it. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rick, or we had maybe the other way around, maybe Ryan first.
I hope this question makes sense. I'm wondering if you were to do, say, the same interview with many of the other folks who were in the room with Trina that day, I'm wondering how at the level of, say, just like that field, how much you think you would be looking for the commonalities in what all of the participants identified in the field shift versus actually the diversity of things that they identify, because that sort of diversity or difference is one of the things that makes those systems durable, right? Yes. And accessible to lots of different people. So I don't know how much of this research has been done at larger scales with lots of people in the same place, and how this field tries to navigate maybe like the touchstones we'd want in a generative social field versus the value of diversity in those fields in the first place?
I love the question. It's actually a question that I'm holding because I wasn't able to do that in my PhD, but I'm planning on doing that in the future, like with the lab, actually, to have people really share about one instant and have this multiplicity of perspectives on it, and then just to investigate it and see what happens. I have a guess that there is a very personal and unique way of experiencing generative social fields, and at the same time it's entangled. And I think the more we get to the bodily layer, there may be something that seems more similar, while the way it's affecting people could be very unique. But that's just my personal guess.
I think if I may just comment on that as well, it's a great question, Ryan. And one of the reasons why we're using this technique as a kind of an entry point into understanding the contextual kind of setting is because we hold an assumption that there might be generic structures that shape a generative field. And if we can begin to learn more about how that's experienced in people, we can be more precise about how to more consistently shape those fields. That's the one thing. The other is that obviously we're going to pair this with a multitude of other ways of studying what goes on in the field. Like, for example, there's been in part of our prototyping, there was a pretty large kind of consistent theme that came up, that there seems to be a kind of a resonance field, an auditory field that people listen into when they hear the quality of the field. We would like to have, biophysical feedback through wearables and seeing if people begin to synchronize as they're experiencing the field becoming more generative, and things like that are all the kind of next levels of explorations that we're integrating into our research here at the lab. So it's exciting.
There's one more question from Rick. Anything we have to say about time now? It's half.
I'll just come in to say we want to really appreciate everyone's boundaries of time and respect that.
Yes.
And we'll stay on for an additional half hour for informal discussion, additional questions. But for any of those who need to depart, I just want to thank you so much for joining our research seminar series. A recording will be sent to all who've registered next week, along with a survey inviting your feedback and ideas for future engagements with the lab. And we hope you join us tomorrow and Thursday for our sessions. Those are in the chat, as well as seminars throughout the year. So thank you all for joining and welcoming all to stay along. And thanks to our presenters today.
Thank you, Lana.
Dr. Herrmann, thank you very much to you and Trina for that very intriguing demonstration. In your introductory remarks, you had just several fascinating insights, but one that completely captivated me and maybe some of the other members of the audience here was your distinction that you were describing how the person you were speaking with should have a distinction between trying to change the student and relate to the student. Oh my gosh, that was fantastic. When you said that, I wondered about, do you have any insights into using that same strategy or not using that strategy outside of the educational environment as a way to try to deal with confrontational or adversarial relationships in work, in society, in group settings, things like that? Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you so much. And it's a crucial distinction. So what I can say from my training as a family therapist, that it's a crucial ingredient for working with families too, for working with couples. And I think it is very applicable to all sorts of, it is in a way, because it is a basic principle of relationships, is that when you try to change the other, there's an element of objectifying the other, as opposed to relating to the other as what Maturana would say, a legitimate other who has his or her own intentions and is a universe of its own, to quote unquote, and relate to that without trying to impose or coerce or in any other way to try to shape the person in a way you want them to. And the systems we operate in are often seem to demand from us that we actually first of all do that with ourselves, so that we shape and coerce and force ourselves to be a certain way. And this is what this teacher was doing. So I want to highlight that. And this is a crucial ingredient in all. The way we show up shapes the field. So if we show up in a way that we are our own captives, this will shape the field. This will shape the responses that the others have. So it is applicable in many, many areas. So I invite Mette and the others also to answer the questions from now. And Tatiana, please.
Oh, hi. A great talk. I'm really happy to be here. I was trying to perceive ways to generate this linkage between the differentiated parts in our complex systems in classrooms and families. And the thing is, we all know that we need to establish connection, but how to do it? Obviously, we need to work ourselves to not create a certain pattern of communication that always results that has the same outputs, right? So how to do it? Yesterday I was talking to, I mentioned in the chat, to Annette Daniel. She's a therapist that gets people that don't talk to talk, people with serious brain injuries to do amazing things. And I was like, how does she do it? Science can't explain it. And she was telling me all about what we're talking about here. I never look at a subject, at a patient, thinking how to fix it. First, establish connection, because I know there's intelligence in there. And I need to create the conditions in which this intelligence arises. And I know that I just have to offer this brain opportunities to establish small differentiations so it can do the job itself. I cannot work inside the brain. I can only create these conditions. And listening to her explaining the principles in which her work is involved, the constraints in which she utilizes the method, it's exactly what we're talking about here. It's how to approach another human being, first of all, reducing the fear and creating a place where we can all communicate, because the magic happens through the right interaction. But how to do it? We all know we need to do it, but how to keep ourselves controlled enough in order not to judge, in order not to jump into old patterns of behavior. So any thoughts on that? Exactly like the last questions, I would be most appreciative.
Well, I can take a pass at that, Tatiana. Thank you so much. And you're definitely pointing to something that is, I think, a vital and inherent experience for many of us that most of us haven't had a proper language for. So we can kind of feel when it works, but we don't actually know how to address it kind of cognitively. And part of the framework that we've developed, which for about 10 years has now been in the kind of as an iterative and very eclectic process of integrating best practices from social emotional learning, from systems thinking and education, from contemplative practices, from this whole understanding of living systems, from neuroscience, from science of well-being, and so on. There is the framework that we've created is addressing exactly that, how we can begin to somehow get to know ourselves better so that we more intentionally can show up in spaces and self-regulate differently, so that the outcomes that we collectively produce as manifestations in society will become shaped by a more intentional stance. And it's there's not a one size fits all. And I would always hesitate to think that there are any quick fixes or anything where it'll just then, happily ever after is probably not part of this equation. However, intentional ever after can be, and connected ever after can be as well. So it doesn't mean that all the emotions and all the aggression and all the kind of negative thoughts and all of that still happens. It still occurs. It still rises in us. We still want to kick someone when they're in our faces in a negative way and so on. But how we deal with it can change. And that's actually the subtleties of this particular way of operating. And we didn't invent it. We just kind of synthesized it and put it together and teach it in a way where it's really accessible for people based on foundational human principles, right? We all have a body, we all know how to breathe, we all have some kind of reflective capacity, we all can feel connected with other people and feel a sense of love and so on. So those are the kind of portals or entry points we use to work at this most foundational layer of what it means to be a human being and to live intentionally and to produce different outcomes for the future.
Thank you.
So now it's just a kind of an informal chat for those who would like to join. We were just well aware that keeping, the boundaries for the actual presentation and so on is a great thing, and that probably there might be people who would still like to just hang out and talk to each other. So please don't see it as only a kind of a Q&A session, but also if there are kind of other reflections that would be great to share in the space, you're more than welcome to.
Well, I don't know if it helps, but yesterday, Annette told me about this researcher that's using sensors, wearable sensors, to really understand what changes in the mind and body of the practitioner and the subject during sessions. Maybe there's something else there so that we can establish a visual connection to what's really going on. I'll just put a link about this researcher.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Appreciate it.
Good. I had something about the overall approach that you were just referring to.
Yes.
So it's not surprising, and it's really important that there are lots of tools and methods. You just saw the demonstration of one. I think that's really important. It's sort of like, you need ways to practice, right? In any artistic domain, you have practices, and those are methods, and you do those. But the thing that was lovely about the demonstration, I think, illustrates the kind of complementary or dual notion, which is somebody has to do the practice. In other words, there's the tools, then there's the tool user. There's the modality of a reflective protocol, but then there's the actual doing of it. And in that, something can happen. I think the demonstration that Lukas, you and Trina did, I could feel, I suspect I'm not unique, you could feel something shift in that engagement. Of course, I'm doing the feeling. So, the part of the systems perspective that's always been very obscured because it's grown up in this Western, I won't use the word reductionistic, because obviously the whole systems perspective is try not to be reductionist, but it's still externally oriented. It's still materially oriented. What can you see? What can you measure? What actually happened? But there's somebody doing the seeing. There's somebody doing the measuring. There is always someone in there. No, everything said is said by someone. So this kind of determination to practice in a way that's always, I'll just use the word profoundly reflective, recognizing that I'm the one there. It doesn't make me any more important, but it does shift the whole spirit of it. So I do think that it's this kind of magical chemistry of the tools and methods and people who are really dedicated to using them. The best analogy I can use is an artistic community. There is something that occurs in an artistic community. It is the community phenomenon itself. So our kind of vague aspiration in all this is to continue to keep advancing the tools and methods and understanding what you can write about, talk about, and all that, and simultaneously continue to keep nurturing the community of practitioners doing it.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any other reflections or comments or questions that would be good to share in the space?
I'd like to ask quickly if you have any communities of practice who are artists who use the arts and crafts as a way to generate conversation, because it wasn't until my daughter was born and she's dyslexic and really art was her first language. And it really made me see how rich of a language it is and how sometimes it's even more conducive than reading and writing and expressing what's going on.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. The primacy of our work has always been in education. We're ready now, as I said, to open it up to systems in general, to people. And I can only imagine what can arise of kind of self-organized processes like what you're describing there, community of artists coming together in this shared contextual understanding and relational awareness in a different way. To my knowledge, I haven't seen any of that as of yet. It's a fairly, we've been at this for 10 years. We're building on a lot of work that's been happening and growing and developing, and a lot of science that's been growing and developing for decades. But the synthesis and bringing it together and having this pretty formal way in which we teach it and help people start the practices and so on, and how we're engaging over time is a fairly new thing. So I think we're just at the beginning stages of exploring what all this can lead to. My aspiration for the whole thing, Savala, is I don't know, as we talked about before, right? I don't know what needs to change in the global economic system, for example. I just don't know enough about it to say anything valid about what I think the changes should be. But I know enough about that if we teach children, if we share these spaces with children and give them these tools and practices from onset on, so that they can grow and learn and thrive in a way where they're constantly in relationship and they're constantly in a kind of a resonance field of awareness, and they can flourish and become the best versions of themselves, and that's the product of education in a way, then I can only imagine the kinds of fields that can unfold from that. I basically just want to think about politics globally. I mean, I think politics sucks in most countries, basically, right? We have a lot of polarization and a lot of really challenging situations happening in many, many countries in the world. Imagine if the next generation of politicians were all trained in this way. Of course, there would still be conflict. Of course, there would be, a conflict of interest and different ways in which we see the world and so on. But the way in which we would get at it would be profoundly different. And that's basically what we're aspiring to. So for my knowledge, at least, I haven't seen any of what you're describing with communities of practice around artists, but I can imagine and aspire to see stuff like that organically growing and kind of self-organizing in the future.
To me, I see it as it's another connection, because as a grad student, I was with Project Lighthouse at MIT Media Lab, and I traveled to the northern communities of Thailand, and to see the traditions of the artists and craftsmen, there's so much diversity and variety, very similar to languages, because I also studied linguistics, and it struck me because you could tell these are the languages that they're learning, right? And it's very easy for people in those communities to identify like, oh, this craft is from this village, And yeah, I'm reconnecting with the Thai communities now, and I can see how that could really be a productive way, because there's a language barrier for sure with the Thai practitioners in terms of accessing this framework through reading and writing papers, and it's not what they're used to. So I'm just beginning to think about how arts and crafts could potentially be used to connect.
Lovely. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'll include that I was very fortunate to be interviewed by Lukas and Lana not too long ago. I'm Lisa Solis, and I'm one of the site development in Southern California in Ventura County. So we've been working quite closely with Trina and Peter and Mette, Lukas, Miho, I see and Dan here on the screen. And I would say that we did it virtually. And knowing that we've been in this process of learning since about 2019, and now going deeper into the school side, into our county office, which serves close to 125,000 students, the process allows you to really take that time to pause and to listen for inquiry, to actually go to that arts part of your brain that's thinking about how you're feeling and what you're doing. And I think the best part is then the reflective backwards from Lana and Lukas, or whoever's interviewing just happens to be, is, oh, I noticed that when you speak, your hands come out. I noticed that when you said that things were connected. Tell me more about when your hands connected and how it was in that space when things were working. So again, I also agree, as many tools that work for the context of the work, it's wonderful to have those processes. And I know I'm leaving now to see one of our content specialists who's working with our new initiative in California, which is our 4-year-olds entering the school system. And we can't just say, okay, now you're going to do writing, reading, math. And so her workshop today is around arts and storytelling and oral history, so that they can bring in their cultures, their experiences as itty bitties, without having to have those fine motor skills that make them either great or not great so early in their educational setting. So I just thought I'd offer that before I had to leave.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That sounds absolutely adorable, and I can see the scenario of really vibrant little kids, and it's insanely messy at the same time with all the stuff they're producing. So I can just imagine that. So thank you for sharing. And that whole way in which we can begin to gauge the experiences at the different layers of the system in this way is basically informing how we can develop our methodology further, so that we don't just take for granted that we understand something about what's moving in people and now we start measuring for that, but that we are actively integrating the experiences that are shared by people about what works in the systems when we engage in compassionate systems change, and make sure that there's a kind of a focus on integrating that more deeply. So that's all we have to share today. Tomorrow, we're gonna focus on another aspect of the lab, which has to do with learning and play, and learning as play, and through simulations and games, and how we can kind of integrate that into learning processes. Dan Roy, who is here on the call, is another of our research affiliates here at the Systems Awareness Lab, and he'll be in conversation with the youth leadership team that we have at the Center for Systems Awareness, and our PI, Professor Eric Klopfer here at MIT, who is specialized in all this stuff with learning through play. For me personally, it was one of the one of the things that I loved to study the most is play behavior in animals. Way back when I was a young student, that was my whole entry into this, because it's such a rich context and rich contextual setting when we engage in play. And we learn a lot about what's going on in the real world, but because it's play, we can try out different strategies that are not challenging or dangerous or critical to us. If we played it out in real life, it could be dangerous or challenging, or we would get some kind of adversarial response. So that's the kind of sits at the heart of what we're trying to explore tomorrow. And then on Thursday, there's another session that Peter will host with some of the practitioners who've been in this work for a long time, and a Professor Jean Clinton, who is has a great many years of experience and expertise in understanding early learning. And it has to do with the innate systems intelligence of children and how we can really bring that forth and cultivate that as a kind of a core premise in what education is all about. So stay tuned, and we will have many more fantastic sessions going forward, and we will of course share that with you all as soon as they get scheduled. I'm feeling, Lana, that I now said a lot of the stuff that you actually wanted to say, so we'll have repetition. Okay, all right, well, thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure engaging with you all. Thank you for the qualified listening and great questions and just spirit of engagement. We really appreciate it. So much fun to be on this path together with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Terima
Thank you from my
kasih.
side too.
Thank you
Great
very
session.
much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
Obrigada.
Bye.
Gracias.
Gracias para todos.
Gracias.